What's up, you guys? Sean Ross at Fightful.com here with a name that you guys know, Eric Bischoff, and he's going to be talking what happened when 83 weeks with Tony Schiavone and Eric Bischoff happening Monday, April 8th. Matinee show so you can catch it before Raw. Eric Bischoff, how you doing?
I'm doing really well. Looking forward to getting to New York and getting the party started.
It's so interesting the way things have developed with technology and podcasting. I mean, I make no bones about it on our own show. I think your podcast is, quite frankly, one of the best in wrestling, if not the best. It's taken such a unique look at the business aspects of pro wrestling. Like, for example, AWA is a little bit before my time, but I listened to your episode on it. I was enthralled. Like, there were all these aspects and how it developed. When did you know that this was going to be a runaway hit? Because obviously there was some success with Bruce and Conrad prior, but yours is something almost completely different.
It is different. And as you know, many of your listeners may know, I did a podcast previously with a young man by the name of Nick Hausman.
Who'd he ever beat?
Huh?
Who'd he ever beat?
Absolutely nobody. Which is why we're not doing the podcast any longer. And I tagged in with Conrad.
Nick's a buddy, but yeah, nice fella.
No, he's a good guy, and he worked really hard. He was very enthusiastic, and I can say a lot of great things about Nick. But the approach that Nick took, Nick and I, was we spent more time talking about current events. You know what I mean? And that was largely because of me. I didn't feel that there were enough people interested in the past to talk about it. Meaning, it's been 20 some odd years since the Monday Night Wars. And there's been books written about it. There's been DVDs produced about it. There's been God knows how many hours of interviews and shoot interviews and all that kind of stuff over the last 20 years, that it just didn't seem to me that anybody would be really interested. Fast forward, when Conrad and I started speaking and we started talking about the format, Conrad was convinced that with a proper format, he could help make that discussion about the Monday Night War era very interesting. So I tagged into his experience. He was having a ton of success, as you pointed out, with Bruce Pritchard. I know when I'm talking to somebody who knows more than I do about something, so I was anxious to tag in. But literally after the first or second episode, we realized that we were in a sweet spot, because out of the chute, we were one of the top rated, podcasts in all the charts, and probably, other than Bruce Pritchard, the number 2 wrestling podcast out there. So very, very excited about it. We knew it pretty quickly. Probably by the second and third episode. So it's been off and running ever since.
And I mentioned the business aspect of that. You go in deep about like marketing deals and for example, why it was important to do a show in Sturgis and the relationships that you wanted to develop. I'm sure a lot of these are questions that you've heard posed, maybe hypothetically over the years by people who didn't know. Now is your chance to kind of answer those. Have you had anybody that's come to you and be like, whether in the business or out, and be like, you know what? I thought one way of you, then I listened to the podcast and I think something completely different because some of these questions are answered.
Yeah, I don't think, I've had a number of people over the last almost a year now, quite frequently, actually, respond to something that we discussed on the podcast and reach out to me through social media or otherwise and say, wow, now I understand why you did what you did. Not so much about, whether they liked me before better or not, but at least they understand the why of it. For 20 some odd years, the narrative about WCW has been produced, published, discussed primarily by people who were not a part of any of the processes. Even the talent, and I'm not going to name names, but even some of the top talent, in WCW at that time, they had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. They didn't really understand the business side of the wrestling business. They understood the wrestling side of the wrestling business. And certainly, they were well aware of, some of the dysfunction that occurs when a company is growing as fast as WCW was growing from, 95 through 2000 or 99, I should say. But as far as understanding the business side of it and what drove some of those decisions, none of them, including the top talent, were really a part of any of those discussions. So their point of view and their narrative was skewed by their own experiences, which is, that's normal. It's human nature. A lot of the rest of the narrative was augmented by, newsletter writers and dirt sheet writers and people who really had an agenda, and I think we all know who they are. At least if you listen to my show, you do,
Yeah.
or Bruce's. So, between the, top wrestling stars who really didn't understand what we were doing or why, and, the peripheral writers and talking heads, if you will, who really didn't understand anything and relied primarily on their little stooges, or, as I call them, little birds, after watching Game of Thrones. The narrative was obviously very, very skewed, tainted, and uninformed for about 20 or 25 years. So what this does is it gives me an opportunity not to justify, not to try to, pat myself on the back, but I do get the opportunity to explain the why of it. Not what happened, but why it happened. Because that's a conversation that very few people can have. Bruce Pritchard is a far better storyteller than I am. And he has a wealth of stories to tell because he worked at a very high level in the industry for a very, very long time, longer than I have, actually. And I've been in the business, one way, shape, or form for 30 plus years. But Bruce's experience is from the point of view of someone who primarily was involved in the talent side of the equation. Bruce really wasn't involved in the business side to the degree that I was. Tony Schiavone, he has an entirely different perspective. He came up through the NWA. He's got a rich history with a lot of the big names that were such a big part of the NWA and who went on to become, an important, critical part of WCW. Tony Schiavone was working for WCW when I showed up as a C-Squad announcer. I actually reported to Tony Schiavone in our corporate structure at WCW when I first started. So his experiences and points of view are far different than mine. And Tony's a very funny guy. I'm not really very funny. I don't have a great sense of humor. But Tony he's a blast. So he's got a great perspective. He's got great storytelling ability, and he's funny as hell. So, Bruce can tell, stories that neither Tony or I can talk about, and he's a great storyteller. Tony tends to add a tremendous amount of humor to his format, and I have the ability to talk about the why of it all and the business side of the wrestling business. So each of our shows are very similar, especially in that we have Conrad Thompson as a co-host. But at the same time, they're each very, very different from each other. And I think that's what makes it fun. I love listening to Tony. I love listening to Bruce's show with Conrad because it's a different point of view. Mine just happens to be more about the business of the wrestling business. And I think many people find that interesting because it's information they can't get anywhere else.
Well, all three of you have been involved in elements of production. And I'm always really curious to see how someone like you would think of the way things are done today. Are there things when you look at WWE programming that you look at and you say, oh, I wish we would have done that and could have? Because I know that you've mentioned on the show about how drone shots replace very expensive helicopter shots now, and you can do that for a few $100. But are there things that you look at and say, we could have done that and I wish we did, or things that you see from WWE and you're like, maybe I don't like that they do this?
Those kinds of thoughts really don't occur to me when I watch the programming. My kind of macro perspective on current WWE product is that it's phenomenal. It's always been phenomenal. Vince McMahon has always put production value, very high on the list of things to do whenever he produces something. He always has. That's what differentiated Vince McMahon and the WWF, when they decided to break away from the old territory regional syndication model and launch a show on cable. The show on cable was vastly superior to anything anybody had ever seen before because he increased the production values so dramatically. The pay-per-views, again, super high production values, in a way that nobody had ever seen before, which, back in the 80s when, the business was really exploding, as a result of cable and kind of breaking down the territory system, they became the, NFL Super Bowl of wrestling pay-per-views. They were so spectacular, and he set the bar so high. Now, fast forward, when I made executive producer, one of the things that I did was want to try to even catch up to being close to the production values of WWF. But we were so far behind them in terms of our resources, our experience, our infrastructure, our ability to achieve that level of high production value was almost impossible until Nitro came along. And when the game changed, starting in 95, but really changed in 96, now I was in a position, because we had more resources, more success creates more resources. And by 1996, 97, 95 really, we started getting the resources we needed to be at least remotely competitive on a production value level. And I think we exceeded the WWF. If you go back and look at what WCW, you put a WCW Nitro show in 1996, pick any week you want, and then put that side by side on a monitor, if you can, and watch the WWF product. I would say that in some respects, the WWF product still had higher production values and a more sophisticated presentation because they had more experience. They had, staff that had been doing it for a long time. They were still a little glossier than us at WCW, but I would argue that what we did in terms of production, starting off with going live, going to the backstage areas and allowing our stories to play out in parts of the venue that nobody else had ever done before, to give it that sense of realism, so that all of the confrontations didn't simply happen either in the ring or outside of the ring. All of our stories, not all of them, but many of them started now to unfold back in the locker room area, or back in a production truck, which had never been done before, or outside of a production truck when Kevin Nash lawn darted Rey Mysterio into the side of the truck on live television. All of those things from a production point of view were things that had never been done before. And the WWE was forced eventually to kind of follow our lead. So I think, still to this day, no one can come close to the level of production values in terms of gloss and glitz and quality, but in terms of a production value that actually moves the needle, I think we far surpassed them and forced them to kind of follow our format and our way of presenting the product. Long-winded way of answering your question, but there's not always a simple answer.
Hey, long-winded answers get my word count up, Eric. I'm cool with that.
Well, yeah, I forgot. I don't want to get your word count up to the point where you lose people. But, when you talk about production values, you kind of have to look at it from more than one perspective. Is whose graphics are cooler, or who's got the best pyro? Those are very obvious things. But going from tape to live, head-to-head, had a far more significant impact on the wrestling industry than really cool graphics. And when I look at WWF now, even today, I love their product. Nobody can come close to, outproducing them. But for my taste, it's a little too glossy still. It doesn't feel live. There's no sense of urgency. And I think it's almost a subconscious, anything can happen. That's a big advantage to going live, is that you condition the audience to believe or to feel, or even subconsciously, that because it's live, it's a little more dangerous because anything can happen. And that's something that really drives viewership for wrestling, or at least it did. And I think by producing a show that's so glossy, you almost forget that it's live. You know that it is, but you kind of forget because it's just too glossy. But you know what that is? That's just my own taste. That's my own point of view. It doesn't mean I'm right. It's just how I feel about it.
Well, I know a lot of people are looking forward to What Happened When 83 Weeks with Tony Schiavone and Eric Bischoff. Reminder, check that out on Monday, April 8th. It is a matinee show. And, of course, Eric Bischoff's show drops every Monday at, I believe, midnight Eastern, correct?
That is correct. And the cool thing about Littlefields, where the show's going to be, is it's only blocks away from the Barclays Center. So if you're going to Monday Night Raw and you happen to be in town for it, if you're going to make an entire 3-day weekend out of the event, then we're the only matinee in town, I believe, wrestling matinee. We're only blocks away from Barclay, so you can come check out our show, get yourself geared up, primed up, maybe have a cocktail or two, and literally walk right over to the Barclay Center and be there in plenty of time for Raw. So it's a great opportunity for everybody.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for being generous with your time and speaking to me. Hope to do it again.
All right, I look forward to it anytime, my friend.